Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you to Nikita and to all his colleagues in St. Petersburg for inviting me to talk. And it's just a shame that we can't all be in St. Petersburg and have the chance to chat face to face. But maybe that'll happen another time. So I guess the background for my talk really was the sometimes explicit, often tacit assumption that content and context in social network analysis are additions, relatively superficial extras that we might occasionally tag on to a social network analysis to embellish one or two points, but that the real focus is these hard, solid networks that we focus upon primarily. And I suppose also the secondary, again, often tacit, but sometimes explicit assumption that qualitative forms of analysis are softer. So we have the hard science of network analysis, the graph theory, and the exponential random graph models, or whatever they might be. And then we have these kind of softer bits at the side, the qualitative methods. And I, in a sense, wanted to try to turn that around and look at that in a slightly different way. Firstly, by suggesting that rather than content and context being something that we add to a network, maybe in order to shed a little bit more light on it, in actual fact, networks are what we get when we strip all these other kinds of things away. So networks are a construct. There's something that we create, and we create them by radically simplifying the observable world, by stripping away lots of aspects of what I'm calling content and context, such that we're left with a digit in an adjacency matrix, or we're left with an edge on a graph. So that there's nothing optional about content and context in that sense. There's nothing separate. Content and context aren't separate from the network. It's just that the network is what you get when you abstract and bracket all of those other kinds of things out. And in fact, a network is a radical simplification. A network, as we analyze it in social network analysis, is a radical simplification of the observed world that we purport to analyze. And then I think from that point of view, qualitative analysis isn't so much soft as a means of recapturing and re-engaging complexities which we have systematically excluded by adopting the methodological procedures that we have. So that we can think of qualitative analysis as being a matter of grasping and engaging, re-engaging complexities, rather than a kind of soft addition to social network analysis. Now, none of that is intended as a criticism or in any way to demean what we do when we do the mathematical and statistical aspects of social network analysis. I mean, one of my arguments is that, of course, simplification is necessary. Simplification is what happens in science all of the time. And if we didn't simplify, we wouldn't be able to identify, analyze, focus on patterns of of any kind. And analysis should be a matter of striking the balance between oversimplification and undersimplification. But what I'm trying to do is and what I do in much of the broad body of the paper is try to explore some of the dangers of oversimplification, some of the dangers of what happens when we just strip too much of that content and context out of the picture. And the paper more broadly then is a call for a different way of thinking about content, context and qualitative analysis, and one about thinking about how we strike the balance between over and under simplification in what we do, and that is the gist of it. I have a slide from the talk which I could show, but I guess I don't think that's necessary. I think I've summarised the points. So sorry, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Oh, well, it's up to you if you like to show it, if you think it could help. I would like to invite questions and comments on Nick's talk, if any of you have any. So just unmute the microphone and start speaking. Oh, well, while you're still seem to still be thinking, I can start with a question of my own. I actually have several, but yeah, first of all, I think it's really stimulative, the points that you've raised. And I found myself thinking about the under and oversimplification in my own research. I think probably many of us, just when these points arise, to start thinking, oh, have I oversimplified things here and under simplified them there? Maybe the latter is even less often considered and even more persistent of an issue, especially recently with the amounts of big data and the detailed data, archival data that we now have. It could be something to make a broader discussion that we currently have, I guess. Because also with the mixed method movement and the relational sociology movement, it's been a lot of debate about that we need to, and also with the topic of this conference, that we need more context to bring in, that we need to analyze the content, that we need to understand what the relations that we study actually are for the individuals, how they develop, and the history, and all these kinds of things. But all this is kind of about bringing more complexity in various ways, no matter how we bring this complexity in. But with this, we also often bring a lot of complexity. Well, probably I start thinking about my own work, the things that, the excessive things that could be dropped or not included in the analysis. That's one of the things. What I wanted, however, to ask you is what you think about. So you very explicitly seem to very explicitly oppose the analysis of context and content with quantitative analysis. So like we have these hard social networks which we analyze quantitatively, and then when we want to add some context or content to it, then the qualitative analysis steps in. There's been a movement which I have to confess I've been also participating in like the social semantic network analysis or social material networks, related closely to the multi-level and multiplex frameworks in network analysis. When we sort of formalize and structurally unfold the context and the content of what's happening in the social networks. And I was wondering, well, given the points here, given the perspective you took in this particular talk and your work actually, what do you think? Perhaps you don't find it feasible at all, addressing context and content quantitatively, like we do in social semantic networks, for instance? Or if you think it's plausible, then what are the potential drawbacks and things we should be cautious about when doing these kinds of analysis?
Yeah, oh, thanks. That's an interesting question. I agree that there are lots of ways of bringing content and context into network analysis. I mean, in some respects, content and context may just be further networks. You know, I mean, it may just be that we contextualize one network by situating it within another. And certainly I had the pleasure of seeing you talk about semantic networks a few weeks ago, and I think certainly those kinds of analyses are further ways of bringing content and context into our analyses. I suppose I mean, I partly didn't focus on those because I don't have much expertise in relationship to those. And also perhaps partly because those methods fit fairly straightforwardly, it seems to me, with the standard procedures of social network analysis. So they're perhaps not as often negatively valued in quite the same way, and perhaps they don't pose quite the same issue. I suppose one of the issues really in the paper is about the way in which the exclusions that we have to make in order to configure observations for network analysis. And I guess some of the kinds of techniques that you are talking about still configure data in a similar kind of way in matrices and so on, which can ultimately be brought into models that we conventionally use. And so whilst I agree completely that bringing in content and context might involve other forms of quantitative analysis, I'm just interested in what our models, what our mathematical and statistical models presuppose in terms of the data that they allow us to work with, and what by necessity gets excluded from those particular kinds of procedures that may nevertheless still be absolutely essential to really getting a grip of what's going on in the particular social world that we are analyzing. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. And I think when we talk about mixed methods in social network analysis, very often what we seem to mean is a combination of quantitative and qualitative. But of course, that's by no means, that should by no means preempt what we might think about in those terms, because there are other forms of quantification which plausibly we might bring to bear.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think it's really reasonable. I think the potential solution to the issues of when our models impose our certain perspective on the data is like going ethnographic, like one of the options. So doing mixed method data collection in the beginning, instead like doing more observations, as Jan has been recently arguing, for instance, rather than like closed-ended survey, posing closed-ended survey questions, which by definition cut off a lot of relevant information that we just ignore by design. And rather we bring it in, like we map, for instance, like cultural mapping, the way John Martin's been putting it several years ago. So when we create, we first inductively create a map of pretty much, or as much as we can, of the cultural landscape that is in place. And then we present it to the reader or to the community, and then we suggest, okay, now we are interested in this and that on this landscape, and let's look here and there. But first we start with this kind of a map, which is importantly inducted by qualitative approaches along with the quantitative ones.
Yeah.
Would anyone like to? Yeah, please.
So hi, thanks a lot. I would like to piggyback on Nikita's question, because it seems to me that you're maybe too conciliatory in saying, well, your argument is that we should pay attention to content and to context, and you have been vocal in arguing for combining quantitative with qualitative methods. And the way I saw it, Nikita was sort of asking, can't we just study content and context quantitatively by other means? And then you're saying, well, this is very important, of course we should do it, but then we might lose the argument for actually doing any qualitative research by saying, well, of course, we can just crunch all these numbers in terms of quantitative text analyses, and that's all we have to do. And a lot of people would be happy with that. And I couldn't see you adopting that position.
No, okay. Well, hi, Jan. Nice to see you. Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I mean, I don't think that any amount of quantitative analysis is going to necessarily capture everything that we can catch by qualitative means, and that certainly in some cases we would want to capture. So I mean, I think that we let me think how we think our way through this. So I mean, one of the things in the actual written paper for this that I tried to look at is things that either happen too irregularly or don't happen sufficiently, or things that happen too much, both of which get excluded by a statistical model. A statistical model needs to be able to make a uniform observation for all cases, and to be able to decide and determine whether the variable is switched on or switched off, or what the value of the variable is for each case. And it strikes me that in a lot of analyses, it's not really possible to do that. So when I looked at my Punk networks, it's possible to say for every pair of nodes in the network, do they have a relationship of a particular type? And the quantitative analysis demands of me that I devise a uniform definition of relationship. I mean, there could be 4 or 5 different types of relationship, but in each case, I have to have a singular definition, and I then have to apply that definition sort of yes or no in all cases. Whereas what I found in the punk case, for example, is that some relationships are important in in fairly unique ways that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to survey across the whole network. Each relationship is a lived history of interaction between the parties to that particular relationship, and they're not uniform. And sometimes we have to focus, in order to understand what's going on, we have to focus in on a particular relationship without really having any sensible quantitative means of doing that, of demarcating that. So I think that or there may be events happen in the network, and it's not always possible, it's not always going to be possible, or if it is possible, it's not always going to be the most logical and straightforward way to deal with those events, by trying in some way to put them into a matrix. And it also strikes me that that there are things that are sort of uniform across a whole network. I mean, statistical mathematical techniques demand of us that we deal with differences. It has to be the case that you have certain attributes, I have different attributes, and we see whether my attributes make X more likely and your attributes make Y. But historical context very often in relationship to a network affects everybody. So there are certain aspects about the historical situation of all of the actors in my punk network which are necessary to understand in order to make any sense of what it is really that they are doing. But you couldn't convert that into a variable because it doesn't vary. It's a constant. They all are affected by that. I mean, a factor that came to me, it's not a perfect example, but one of the ones I think I look at in the written version of the paper is the COVID-19 situation. We are all doing our relationships differently now as a consequence of COVID-19. We all have knowledge of COVID-19. We all have awareness and understanding of COVID-19. It's affecting how all of us do our interactions, as this plenary makes clear. But because it affects all of us, it isn't a variable. And if it's not a variable, it's difficult to know how we fit it into our models. But a paragraph of qualitative historical analysis which described what it was that was going on and why relationships were being done differently very easily and neatly takes care of that kind of thing. So I suppose those are just two examples of things that are too common within the network to make quantitative analysis meaningful, or too rare within the network to make quantitative analysis meaningful. And I mean, there are lots of other things, I guess, that we could look at. I mean, one of the sort of striking things, I think, sometimes when, I'm going to draw a stereotype now. This is a kind of stereotypical bad quantitative researcher, and I accept it's a stereotype, and I accept that I am talking about bad practice. But somebody comes in and they're talking about, I don't know, school children's networks and so on, and it's clear that they have no comprehension whatever of the lived world of their of their nodes. they are there's no understanding of the culture of the people that is involved, and it may be that kind of understanding, that sort of, not exactly ethnographic but sort of hermeneutic engagement with the network doesn't even get written up in a paper, but if it's not there, the models are often very, very peculiar, and don't work. And I've probably said enough, but hopefully that's a strong enough answer. Is that to say certainly not everything can be captured quantitatively.
Yes, I just like to remind everyone, this Zoom thing doesn't allow me to see all of you, only part of the audience. So when you raise hand, I don't necessarily see it. So just unmute and start speaking. I'm afraid that's the only way we can do this. Yeah, but
okay.
Let's see you.
Unmuted. Thanks, Nikita, and thanks a lot, Nick, for doing this presentation and this keynote. I've got two issues to raise a bit. Probably for me, as a person who comes from communication studies, it's quite unusual that you see context and content as something that you add to the formal analysis. Because for us, we study network discussions, and for us, content is the main thing, and the structure of discussion is actually an auxiliary one. So this is just tells something of content rather than, and for me, this is why perhaps I see content as an opposition to the form, so to say. So form and substance is form and content. For me, the structure of the discussion, and content as a substance, so to say. And context for me is sort of a part of a research design, which includes theory, context for operationalization and formation of hypothesis, then methods, and then results and discussion. So I argue that we need sort of a special rubric or special chapter in the papers that we write that would be dedicated to context and to contextual knowledge, and we need much more rigorous procedures to select context. So how does this correspond to what you were saying about content and context? Do you see any linkages to this thought? And my second point is, Nikita said, and probably there's an understanding that you amplify your formal work, your mathematical work, so to say, by adding context to it. But both in computer science and in communication science, adding context is actually to reduce the possibilities of interpretation.
Okay.
It's like, the Malevich's black square. It's nothing there, so you can interpret it the way you want. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you add figurative painting to it, there's much less possibility, much fewer possibilities to interpret it. So it actually doesn't amplify, but reduce all the multitude opportunities to interpret what you actually get as a network, because it's a construct that I absolutely share. Mm-hmm. So these are my points. Could you address them somehow? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I think in terms of your first point, I think part of what I was trying to get at in terms of context not just being the setting, but that certainly in sociological social network analyses, I think that very often people they're not necessarily self-consciously doing networks. They are usually self-consciously doing something else. they are doing teaching in a classroom, or they are doing making music in a city, and and so what I meant really by trying to say that the context is inseparable from the network is that is that we are just abstracting very, very particular elements of actions which that's the best way to put this, of actions which actually have multiple valences, and we need to try to understand that. I suppose the starkest way to put that might be in contrast to stochastic actor-oriented type models, where we more or less assume that nodes are making choices about connections that they will make or break. And of course, we make all kinds of assumptions when we do that, including complete knowledge of the network, usually. But it seems to me that very often people aren't necessarily making self-conscious choices about forming bonds or breaking bonds. They are actually being a student in a classroom, or being a musician in a musical context, and the making or breaking of the ties is a side effect. It's a byproduct of them actually doing something else. So, and it seems to me that in that sense, understanding the activity that they are actually engaged in is indissociable, really, from the network itself. And that was what I was trying to get at, rather than I suppose a more stark separation between context and network, where context might literally just be the physical environment in which interactions take place. So yeah, so I think it's about recognizing that when we do our networks are done. We form ties, we break ties, we maintain ties, but generally speaking, we do that alongside doing other things, and the network part might not always, or even very often, be at the forefront of our conscious awareness. As for the constraints bit, I mean, I agree, and that's quite interesting. I think that is quite an interesting way of looking at it. But I also think that in social network analysis, the network analyst is, I suppose, constrained by the parameters of their own imagination if they don't engage in a contextual analysis, which might actually shed light upon what's going on in the network in ways that they couldn't possibly comprehend. I mean, I'm sure we've all sat. I'm going to use the school example because it's just an easy example, but I'm sure we've all sat and watched a social network analyst do an analysis of network ties in a school, and we think to ourselves, has this person never actually been in a school? You know, there's no comprehension of what actually goes on and how what goes on might conceivably have all sorts of effects upon networks. So whilst I agree that in a sense context constraints. And I think that is useful because some of the ways in which we might think about our networks in a purely theoretical vein can be entirely fanciful, and we may need to be constrained by a consideration of context. And that's quite a useful way of looking at it. But equally, we can be more positively informed by having a grasp of context that allows us to arrive at an understanding of what's going on in the networks that's useful to us. Yeah.
If I could just add a tiny bit to it.
Yeah.
In my paper, which I submitted to this conference, and I still don't know whether it's accepted, but still, I made a distinction between the context of a process and sort of a context behind the process. And taking the metaphor of the school, of school, it's like what's going on in class, what forms the network, how this context, this situational context develops is definitely inseparable from what is going on and from the network itself. But maybe we also need to know how schools in Russia and Germany and in the UK and the USA are organized historically.
Yeah.
This is why they might be different, not just because of the in-school, in-class dynamics, but also because 100 years ago people decided on something in terms of how classes are organized and how many people are there and so on. So I think this distinction might also be useful, maybe, to
yes, yeah. I mean, I think I agree with you. I suppose if I wanted to be provocative, I know that some of my colleagues in ethnomethodology and conversation analysis will say any kind of context is only of any significance if the people involved in the situation bring it in and orient to it. So it could be that it could be that those historical differences between Russian schools and British schools or whatever are only of a significance insofar as they inform the pre-understanding of education that Russian and British students bring to the situation respectively. But I mean, I wouldn't want to push that really because clearly, you know, I'm sure we could find examples that would be very difficult to close down in that way. So yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that's really useful and helpful actually for thinking about this.
Thanks to you, really. Thank you.
Hi, Nick. Long time. If I may piggyback on Svetlana's question and comment, because our presentations in this conference also concern the educational sector. Wouldn't you say, so this is a provocative question, wouldn't you say that sometimes when you start analyzing social network data, you might start out without assumptions and without knowing too much about the situation, because then you might be able to detect patterns and behaviors that might otherwise escape your attention. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I don't think that you can start without assumptions. I mean, you really just wouldn't get off the ground at all without some kind of assumptions. But clearly, we all ought to reflexively criticize our own assumptions and think about them and engage with them and try to see how our assumptions have have informed what it is that we do. I mean, I suppose this isn't exactly an answer to your question, but it touches upon it, hopefully. I mean, I sometimes find that when I've done bits of, I've sort of done a quantitative network analysis, and I've done a qualitative component to that, I then find that the two analyses point in opposite directions, or at least they don't necessarily seem to agree with one another. And I often find that the particularly productive point in an analysis is when I'm trying to reconcile those different pictures that I might have. And I guess in some way that I hope that kind of engages slightly with your question, because I think it's certainly true to say that we don't want to rely just upon our own assumptions, and we want our data and our analysis to challenge our own assumptions. But I think that to some extent that is partly what qualitative analysis is about. It is partly about assuming that it's partly about recognizing that I can't assume to know what goes on in that situation. I can't assume to know what's relevant in that particular situation, and I might need to do some kind of hermeneutic investigation where I'll go in with assumptions, because if I didn't have assumptions, I couldn't think. But I try to engage and challenge those assumptions through engaging with the situation and its actors in a qualitative in a qualitative way. But certainly, certainly the point is to challenge our own assumptions rather than simply to sort of impose them. I don't know if that answers the question or.
Yep. Does. Thanks.
May I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Please. Oh, yeah, I'm trying to. Oh, yes.
Okay. I don't know if you can see me, but I think it's all right. Yeah, I found it thank you so much for your talk. And I found it interesting what you just mentioned, how sometimes the qualitative research would point to opposite interpretation of the results as quantitative. Because I think that a lot of this discussion is also about to what degree do we take, in this case, people's own narratives and motivations of what motivated their behavior as serious and as the ground truth, versus what we find via quantitative patterns. So just to add a little bit to that, I come from like more technical sciences, and I moved into social sciences. For me, it was super interesting to see, oh wait, actually there's all this social reasoning behind motivations of people. So we should really take that into account to our models. But then actually I wondered, like, is that always true? Is that always the ground truth? And I think one good example is like in current day racism. People would say they are not racist. Their behaviors are not motivated from a racist perspective. But, you know, if we look at all the data, we can see there's these structural patterns, and then suddenly that makes us not take their own report of the situation as serious. What do you think of this?
Yeah, no, I agree that I think the challenge has to be in both directions. So I don't think that we can take what people say on face value. I mean, I have to say that qualitatively, I find observation and analysis of naturally occurring data sometimes more persuasive than interviews, because I'm not sure that people can always reliably give an account. But even so, yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree that that it's a two-way conversation, and that the models and the graphs may, and indeed very often do, force us to revise certain of our qualitative conclusions to just the same extent that a qualitative consideration might persuade us that perhaps perhaps the model is wrong, or perhaps the way in which we've gathered data for the model is based on problematic assumptions or whatever. So yeah, no, I agree.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Anyone else like to engage in the discussion? I was also thinking that, well, on the issue that you raised, whether so that perhaps we can't always take what is being said as the ground truth and what people really, whether people really think what they tell us. And that's where quantitative analysis is crucial. But I think it's still important to stress that in this quantitative analysis, it's crucial to rely on what they say, among other things.
Mm-hmm.
So that trying to subject it to perhaps more sophisticated quantitative analysis that reveal things that they do not necessarily mean to express, but the things that they actually mean by that, but still trying to map out their voice in sort of an inductive manner, as opposed to what is being frequently done, like in quantitative analysis. Even if it accounts for the context, it's still deductive in terms of coming with a model.
Mm-hmm.
And now we try to collect the data that would inform this model that we already have.
Yeah.
Instead of having the space mapped. And in doing so, we often find things that, in doing the latter, we are able to find things that we can't necessarily grasp or explain. So, for instance, with statistical modeling, we have, like social networks, we have a whole handful of various patterns that we can include in the network, and we do not, and if we do this in an inductive manner, so that we collect some data in an ethnographic way, we map this space, and then we try to apply the models and try to see which are the mechanisms that are working there. Some of these mechanisms we don't even theorize in advance, but rather we see that they work, albeit we didn't expect them theoretically, and then we have to explain this somehow. Yeah. And then again, the context comes back in and helps us to, as Svetlana said, to reduce this complexity in terms of explanation. So we first bring complexity in during the data collection. Then we kind of reduce it with the modeling, but still trying to capture as much as we can. And then again, we bring context in, but now to reduce the complexity, to be able to explain what's going on, to finite the amount of explanations that we can potentially have.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think sort of following on from that, it is the very often what's interesting from the qualitative point of view, and this touches back on, I think it was Anna's point, is not necessarily so much what people say as what they take for granted. What they take for granted in how they go about doing what they do. And of course, what they take for granted is something that they are often unlikely to give us in an interview directly, because they take it for granted. It seems obvious to them. It doesn't occur to them to say it to us. But that can be absolutely crucial for understanding how they do their relationships, how their activities are structured, and therefore what's likely to happen relationally within their context, and what isn't. And I think that's just, as you're saying about research design, if we take something altogether different for granted when we design our study to what is taken for granted in the situation that we're actually going to go and analyze, then the data that we generate, and therefore anything that gets built upon it, is going to be very weak and far from the mark. Whereas if we have that strong contextual understanding, and as it were simplify from the context itself, so we work out what the world looks like for those people, what they take for granted within that world, and then we kind of simplify from that in order to produce our networks, then I think probably what we have is more rigorous and robust. Sorry, I'm never sure whether when I finish speaking I should do something just to so finished. Yeah,
well, that's if we have no more questions or comments. Oh, do we?
Yeah, just sorry.
Yes,
right now. Thank you for the talk very much. This is a very short note on what do you think of issues of reproducibility and qualitative research? I think that one of the main reasons against, like one of the main arguments against qualitative research is that it's really hard to reproduce it to someone else except for the researcher that has done it. So could you envision any ways in which reproducibility and qualitative understanding of a context, deep understanding of a context could be married?
I think the short answer to that might be that the qualitative investigation is very often trying to engage with the uniqueness of the situation, and recognizing that perhaps no two situations are the same. So you know, on one level, I think that the qualitative aspect goes against that idea of reproducibility. On the other hand, I mean, I think it would certainly be possible that we could consider for particular types of study procedures that we would consider to be recommended, that all researchers researching a particular type of situation might adopt. So there could be reliability and reproducibility of a number of procedures maybe that researchers adopt when they go into the field qualitatively. But I do think that part of the point of the qualitative investigation is to grasp at those unique elements that we wouldn't necessarily expect to find in other networks.
Thanks.
Can I have a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, thank you. So I have a question. As comes on my field, my experience field is diaspora studies, you know, and it's actually has a quite low potential for qualitative methods implementation and structuring networks. So my analysis always rise from context, then overgrow to network structure models. And as for me, the meanings filling the data, the processes go beyond the context and network structure and make a new context beyond the models. How do you see this kind of vision?
Sorry, could you just repeat it?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the minings, filling the data, the processes and the structure go beyond and beyond the structure and make a new kind of content.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that is data mining of existing data sets, or rather than scraping the web. Yeah, of existing data sets. I mean that is. Well, I suppose that poses difficulties for content and context as I'm talking about them, because you haven't got access. If it's not been recorded in the original data, you don't have access. You don't have access to it. And I suppose going back to Jan's point and Nikita's point, the only context you have would be details that allowed you to compare across data sets. This was in Russia, this was in Germany, or whatever. So I don't know. I'm a bit stuck on that. I don't really know how you engage content and context there. I suppose the only thing to be said there is that from the point of view of what I've said, it is important to be mindful of what's perhaps been removed in the original data gathering process, and maybe some of the inconsistencies that emerge and some of the differences that emerge between different data sets then begs questions of content and context that might be addressed in subsequent subsequent analyses. But I guess the thing about all data gathering is that if you don't capture the complexity in the first stage of, you can always simplify complex data later on, but you can't rediscover complexity when coding has already taken place and pushed it out. But yeah, you've got me there, really. I'm not sure what to do.
All right, unless anyone else would like to step in, I guess maybe it's time for us to wrap up the whole conference, actually. But First of all, thank you, Nick.
Can I just thank everybody? Then it's been it's been an unusual experience, but it's been an interesting one. That's been quite a good debate. I think I'm going away with a lot of useful things to reflect on there. And thanks again to Nikita. And I do hope I eventually get to meet the people that I've been talking to at some point. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I do think that you raised a lot of points that require deep thinking and reconsidering what we're doing, and maybe it will, I'm quite sure, certain that it will take some time for us to digest, and maybe we'll be returning to what you said in the coming weeks and maybe months, and keep thinking. Luckily, we have the talks recorded, and we can rewatch and think it again and get in touch, which I invite all of you to do in the forthcoming months.
Yeah, and to me too, certainly. Please email if you want to continue talking.
We can't be sure to be able to get in touch in person really soon, but hopefully for the next NetGlow in 2022. But I think this one was really exciting, and we still, despite all the difficulties and despite all the cancellations that were inevitable, I guess, I think we lost like 2/3 of the talks just because of all this mess with the virus online thing. But we still had lots of really strong, amazing papers and videos recorded, and the papers that we sent around. So I'd like to invite all of you to read those of interest and to comment to the authors, especially because the comments will be very much appreciated, because we are going to enter the stage of paper revisions for the conference volume really soon. So the authors would appreciate feedback right in these 2, 3, 4 upcoming weeks. So please, if you feel any interest in any burning feelings, thoughts about the papers, please, or the talks, please be sure to get in touch with the authors. And I think it will be really timely to do that right now. And of course, I'd like to invite you to follow the LNNS volume of NetGlow. It should be out there by the end of the year. So this way we can continue our communication despite all the emerging distances that occurred these days, not only geographical, but also social and based owing to health issues, and whatever it is, we can still remain in touch and remain a community. So once again, thank you everybody for overcoming all these difficulties, for recording and being online. I know in my own experience, it's not easy at all. But I hope that for many of you, and for all of you, I hope it's been a useful experience that we can draw further. And yeah, I'm sure it's really good that we did record these videos and put them online so that they can remain there and can remain a trigger for further communications. Yeah. Thanks a lot, everybody who participated and contributed to NetGlow this year. So I guess this is it. Thanks again. Goodbye, everybody. See you soon again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.